The Forgotten Echo Doctor. Elena Vasquez brushed the red dust from her hands as she stared at the strange symbols carved into the black stone wall. The alien writing looked different from anything she had seen in her 20 years of studying dead civilizations across the galaxy. Her team of researchers worked quietly around her in the underground chamber they had discovered 3 days ago, on the planet Kepler 442c. "Still no luck with the translation software?" asked Dr. Chen, her research partner. He held a scanning device over another section of the wall, recording everything for later study. Elena shook her head. "The computer says it cannot match these symbols to any known language in the galactic database. That should be impossible. We have records of over 12,000 different alien writing systems." The chamber was large and rectangular, with walls made of smooth, black stone that seemed to absorb light. Strange markings covered every surface, but they were not decorative. Elena had studied enough ancient sites to recognize the difference between art and urgent communication. These symbols had been carved by someone trying desperately to leave a message. "Look at this," called out Sarah, the team's youngest member. She stood near the far wall, pointing her flashlight at a section that looked different from the rest. "There are blast marks here. Something hit this wall with incredible force." Elena walked over to examine the damage. The stone was melted in some places, with deep gouges that suggested weapon fire. But the damage was old, very old. Her scanner indicated the blast marks were approximately 800 years old, give or take 50 years. "This was a battle," Elena said quietly. "Someone fought here and they fought hard." Dr. Chen joined them at the damaged wall. "But who would fight in a place like this? This chamber is buried 50 meters underground. There are no weapons, no bodies, no equipment. Just these symbols and blast marks." Elena studied the pattern of damage more carefully. The blast marks all came from the same direction, as if someone had been trapped in this chamber and firing desperately at attackers coming through the main entrance. But there were no signs of return fire, no evidence that the defenders had been armed with energy weapons. "Maybe they were not fighting with weapons," Elena suggested. "Maybe they were fighting to finish writing their message before someone stopped them." The thought made her feel cold. She had seen many ancient sites where people had died trying to preserve important information, but usually those messages were about natural disasters or disease. The urgency in these symbols felt different, more personal and more afraid. Over the next several hours, the team documented everything in the chamber. They took thousands of photographs, made detailed scans of every symbol, and collected samples of the melted stone for analysis. But the more they discovered, the more questions arose. "Elena, you need to see this," Dr. Chen called from near the entrance. He was examining a small section of wall that had been partially destroyed by weapon fire. "I think I found something that survived." Elena hurried over to see what he had discovered. Hidden beneath a layer of melted stone was a small device no bigger than her thumb. It was made of a metal she did not recognize, and it had somehow survived 800 years of burial without any visible damage. "What do you think it is?" Sarah asked, peering over Elena's shoulder. "I think it is a recording device," Elena replied. She had seen similar technology used by other ancient civilizations to preserve important messages, but I have never seen one quite like this. Dr. Chen carefully extracted the device from the wall and placed it in a protective container. "We should take this back to the ship and analyze it properly. If it really is a recording device, it might help us understand what happened here." As they prepared to leave the chamber, Elena took one last look at the symbols covering the walls. Whoever had written them had worked quickly, with increasing desperation. The symbols near the entrance were neat and carefully carved, but those near the back wall were rough and hurried. The final symbols, carved near where they found the blast marks, looked like they had been scratched into the stone with fingernails. Back on their research ship, Elena connected the strange device to her computer system. At first, nothing happened. Then slowly the device began to emit a soft blue glow. The computer's speakers crackled with static, and then a voice emerged from the noise. The voice was unlike anything Elena had ever heard. It was not quite human, but not entirely alien either. It spoke in a language that sounded familiar but wrong, as if someone was trying to speak a language they had only half learned. But the universal translator managed to pick up fragments of meaning. "The humans, yeah," the voice said, filled with fear and exhaustion. "They never stop. They never forgive. We tried to explain, tried to make them understand. But they do not listen. They just keep coming. The recording dissolved back into static, leaving Elena and her team staring at each other in confusion and growing unease. "That cannot be right," Dr. Chen said slowly. "Humans do not hunt down entire species. We are known throughout the galaxy as peacekeepers and mediators." Elena replayed the recording several times, but the message remained the same. Someone, 800 years ago, had been terrified of humans, terrified enough to hide in an underground chamber and scratch desperate messages into stone walls before dying under human weapon fire. "We need to research this more carefully," Elena said finally. "I want to know everything about what humans were doing 800 years ago. Check the historical records, contact the Galactic Archives, and find out if there are any other sites like this one." Over the following days, Elena's team worked tirelessly to understand what they had discovered. But the more they investigated, the stranger things became. The Galactic Archives had detailed records of human activities going back 1,000 years, but there were odd gaps in the information. Certain events were mentioned briefly and then never discussed again. Some historical documents seemed to be missing pages or entire sections. Most disturbing of all, Elena discovered that several other archaeological teams had found similar sites across the galaxy. Underground chambers with unknown symbols, blast marks from human weapons, and recordings that spoke of fear and desperation. But none of these discoveries had been properly documented or studied. They had all been classified as minor historical curiosities and filed away. Elena realized she was looking at evidence of something that someone wanted forgotten. 800 years ago, humans had done something that required hiding. Something so significant that it had been systematically removed from historical records and buried on distant worlds. But the evidence remained, waiting in dark chambers for archaeologists like Elena to find it. And now that she had found it, she needed to understand what humans had done that was so terrible it could not be remembered, and why the galaxy seemed determined to keep it secret. The recording device sat on her desk, its blue glow pulsing slowly like a heartbeat. Inside it were more fragments of the desperate message waiting to be decoded. Elena knew that once she listened to the rest of the recording, there would be no going back. She would learn something about her own species that might change how she saw humanity forever. But as a scientist and a seeker of truth, she had no choice. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of uncovering the galaxy's most carefully hidden secret. The awakening memory 3 weeks after discovering the chamber on Kepler 442c. Elena stood in the vast halls of the Galactic Archives on the neutral world of Sanctuary Prime. The building stretched upward for kilometers, its walls lined with data storage systems containing the collected knowledge of thousands of civilizations. If answers existed anywhere, they would be here. Elena had requested access to historical records from 800 years ago, specifically focusing on human military activities. What she received was a collection of files so thoroughly edited that they told her almost nothing useful. Entire sections were marked as classified for galactic security, or simply missing altogether. "Dr. Vasquez?" A voice spoke behind her in the reading room. Elena turned to see an elderly Zephyrian approaching her table. Zephyrians were among the longest-lived species in the galaxy, with lifespans that could reach 1,500 years. This one looked ancient even by Zephyrian standards, with silver-blue skin marked by the deep lines that came with great age. "I am Keeper Voss," the Zephyrian said in the whistling accent of his people. "I have been working in these archives for over 900 years. I understand you are researching human military history from the 8th century before present." Elena nodded carefully. "Yes, I am trying to understand some archaeological discoveries my team has made, but the records seem incomplete." Keeper Voss settled into a chair across from Elena with obvious difficulty. His movements were slow and deliberate, as if each action required great effort. "Dr. Vasquez, in my 9 centuries of work here, I have learned that some gaps in historical records exist for good reasons." "What do you mean?" Elena asked. The old Zephyrian was quiet for a long moment, staring at the data pad in Elena's hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "There are things that happened in the galaxy's past that were so terrible, so destructive, that the surviving species agreed they should be forgotten. Not just ignored or classified, but actively erased from memory." Elena felt her heart beating faster. "Are you talking about something humans did?" Keeper Voss looked around the reading room nervously, as if checking to see who might be listening. The room was nearly empty, with only a few other researchers working at distant tables. I was young when it happened, barely past my first century. But I remember the fear. The entire galaxy was afraid of what humans had become. What did we become? Elena pressed. Unstoppable, Voss replied simply. For 6 months, human fleets moved through space like a plague. They were not exploring or trading or negotiating. They were hunting. And what they were hunting? He paused, shaking his head. No one speaks that name anymore. It has been erased from every database, every record, every memory that could be altered. Elena leaned forward in her chair. But you remember? I remember fragments, Voss admitted. I remember the emergency sessions of the Galactic Council, where species after species begged the humans to stop. I remember trade routes being abandoned because no one wanted to accidentally encounter a human fleet. I remember the fear in everyone's eyes when they spoke about what the humans might do next. What were they hunting? Elena asked. What species could make humans act that way? Keeper Voss was silent for such a long time that Elena wondered if he had fallen asleep. Zephyrians sometimes entered brief meditative states when processing difficult memories. But finally he spoke again. They called themselves, no, I will not speak that name even now, but they were proud, arrogant beings who believed they were superior to all other life in the galaxy. They had advanced technology and powerful weapons, but more than that, they had complete contempt for what they saw as lesser species. That describes half the civilizations in the galaxy, Elena pointed out. Arrogance is not usually enough to justify extermination. This was different, Voss said, his voice growing stronger with remembered anger. They did not just feel superior. They decided to prove it in the most horrible way possible. Elena waited, but Voss seemed reluctant to continue. Finally, she asked, what did they do to humans? Not just to humans, Voss replied. They chose human settlements because they wanted to send a message to the galaxy about what happened to species that tried to expand beyond their proper place. But the way they did it... He stopped, shaking his head again. Please, Elena said. I need to understand what happened. Voss looked directly at Elena for the first time since sitting down. His large, dark eyes held a sadness that seemed to reach back across centuries. They destroyed 3 human colony worlds. Not just the humans living there, but everything. Every plant, every animal, every microorganism. They used weapons that sterilized entire planets, turning them into dead rocks floating in space. Elena felt cold despite the warm air in the archive building. How many people? Nearly 2 million humans across the 3 worlds, Voss said quietly. But that was not the worst part. The worst part was that they broadcast the attacks live across the galaxy. They wanted everyone to watch. They wanted us all to see what they could do to species that displeased them. Elena understood now why the galaxy had tried to forget. The scale of the atrocity was almost beyond comprehension, but it still did not explain why humans had apparently hunted an entire species to extinction. What was the human response? She asked. Voss stood up slowly, preparing to leave. Dr. Vasquez, in all my centuries of life, I have seen many wars. I have witnessed conflicts between species that lasted for generations, battles that destroyed star systems, diplomatic failures that led to millions of deaths. But I have never seen anything like what humans did after those 3 worlds were destroyed. What did they do? They became something that the galaxy had never seen before and hopes never to see again, Voss replied. They became absolutely committed to a single purpose. And that purpose was making sure that the species responsible for those attacks would never hurt anyone ever again. Elena watched the old Zephyrian walk away, his words echoing in her mind. She spent the rest of the day searching through the archives, looking for any additional information about human activities 800 years ago. But the more she searched, the more obvious it became that the records had been systematically altered. However, Elena was not easily discouraged. If the official records had been changed, perhaps she could find evidence in unofficial sources. She began searching for personal journals, private communications, and other documents that might have escaped the galaxy-wide effort to erase this history. Late that evening, Elena found what she was looking for in the personal archive of a Corinthian trader who had lived during the period in question. Corinthians were obsessive record keepers, documenting every detail of their business transactions and travels. This particular trader had written detailed journal entries about the economic disruption caused by what he called the human war. According to his journal, human fleets had systematically destroyed every settlement, outpost and ship belonging to the unnamed species. But what made the journal entries particularly disturbing was the traitors' description of how methodical and patient the humans had been. They did not attack in anger or passion, but with cold, calculated precision. The humans track them like hunters following wounded prey, one journal entry read. They do not hurry because they know their quarry cannot escape. They follow every trail, investigate every rumor, search every system where survivors might be hiding. They are not trying to win a war. They are trying to make sure that when they are finished, no trace of their enemy will remain. Elena read through dozens of similar entries, each one painting a picture of humans as an implacable force that could not be reasoned with, bargained with, or stopped. The picture that emerged was terrifying, but it was also puzzling. This did not sound like the humanity she knew. As she prepared to leave the archives that night, Elena realized she had only begun to understand what had happened 800 years ago. She had learned that humans had been capable of systematic destruction on an unprecedented scale, but she still did not know why they had chosen such an extreme response. Tomorrow she would continue her research. She would find out what could drive her gentle, diplomatic species to become the monsters described in these hidden records. The unforgivable act Elena finally found the complete records buried in the emergency archives of the Galactic Medical Corps. Medical records, it seemed, were harder to alter than historical documents. The galaxy's medical organizations had kept detailed files on every major disease outbreak, natural disaster, and mass casualty event for over 1,000 years. And what had happened to the human colonies 800 years ago definitely qualified as a mass casualty event. Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation to Elena's research partner, had been the chief medical officer assigned to investigate the attack on New Terra, the first human colony to be destroyed. Her report was clinical, detailed, and absolutely horrifying. Elena read the report alone in her hotel room on Sanctuary Prime, having copied the files to her personal datapad. As she read, she began to understand why the galaxy had worked so hard to erase this history from memory. New Terra had been a thriving agricultural colony with a population of just over 600,000 humans. They grew crops that fed dozens of other human settlements and traded peacefully with several alien species in the region. The colony was known for its universities, its art museums, and its beautiful botanical gardens that contained plant species from across the galaxy. According to Dr. Chen's report, the attack had been preceded by several days of ominous communications. Ships belonging to the unnamed species had appeared in the New Terra system and broadcast a message to the entire galaxy. Elena found a transcript of that message buried in the medical files. People of the galaxy, the message had begun, you have allowed a primitive and dangerous species to spread beyond their homeworld. Humans believe they have the right to claim territory among the civilized races of the galaxy. Today we will demonstrate why this belief is incorrect. Watch and learn what happens to species that do not know their proper place. The attackers had given the colonists on New Terra 12 hours to evacuate. But evacuation was impossible. The colony's spaceports and communication systems had been destroyed in the first wave of attacks. The 600,000 people on New Terra were trapped on their world with no way to call for help and no way to escape. What happened next had been broadcast live across the galaxy on every major communication network. Elena found recordings of the broadcasts in the medical files, marked as evidence for war crimes tribunals that had apparently never taken place. She forced herself to watch the recordings, though she had to pause several times to collect herself. The weapons used by the attacking species were unlike anything she had seen before. They did not simply destroy buildings or kill people. They unmade life itself on a molecular level. The process was slow and deliberate. It began with the planet's plant life, which withered and died over the course of several hours. Then the insects and small animals began to collapse, followed by larger creatures. The humans on New Terra had time to understand what was happening to them before they died. In the final hours of the broadcast, the cameras showed empty cities where 600,000 people had lived just days before. Every street was filled with the remains of what had once been a thriving civilization. But the attackers were not finished. They continued using their weapons until even the bacteria in the soil were destroyed, leaving New Terra as a lifeless ball of sterile rock. Similar attacks followed on the colonies of Hope's End and New Canaan. Each attack was broadcast live, and each one followed the same horrifying pattern. The attackers wanted the galaxy to watch. They wanted everyone to understand the fate that awaited species that tried to expand beyond what they considered appropriate boundaries. Elena found records of the galactic response to these attacks. Emergency sessions of the Galactic Council had been called, with representatives from hundreds of species condemning the attacks and demanding justice. But the species responsible had simply responded that they were providing a valuable lesson to the galaxy about the natural order of things. Most disturbing of all, Elena discovered that some species had actually supported the attacks. Several civilizations had sent messages congratulating the attackers for putting the humans in their place and expressing hope that similar lessons would be taught to other upstart species. The human response had been swift but initially restrained. Human representatives had appealed to the Galactic Council for justice, asking for the attackers to be arrested and tried for genocide. When the council proved unable to take action, the attackers were too powerful and had too many supporters. Humans had announced they would pursue justice through their own means. Elena found the transcript of the final human statement to the Galactic Council, delivered by Admiral Sarah Morrison 3 days after the destruction of New Canaan. The statement was brief and direct. The species that destroyed our colonies has demonstrated that they consider mass murder to be an acceptable form of political communication. They have shown our children no mercy and have promised to show no mercy to other species they consider inferior. We cannot allow this threat to continue existing in the galaxy. We will pursue these criminals until they surrender unconditionally and face justice for their crimes. If they choose not to surrender, we will pursue them until none remain to threaten anyone ever again. Most of the Galactic Council had assumed the humans were making empty threats. Humans were known as a diplomatic species, skilled at negotiation and compromise. Even their military forces were primarily used for peacekeeping and disaster relief. Few species believed that humans were capable of the kind of systematic warfare that would be necessary to defeat a technologically advanced enemy. They were wrong. Elena found shipping records that showed the massive mobilization of human resources that began immediately after Admiral Morrison's statement. Every human world had contributed ships, supplies, and personnel to what humans called the Justice Fleet. Scientists who had never worked on military projects began developing new weapons. Engineers who had spent their careers building hospitals and schools began designing warships. But the most significant change was in the humans themselves. Elena found personal communications from human colonies that showed how quickly and completely human society had transformed itself. Normal activities had stopped. Art, entertainment, sports, and other peacetime pursuits were abandoned. Every human settlement became focused on a single goal: providing whatever support the Justice Fleet needed to complete its mission. The first engagement between human forces and the attacking species had taken place near the Vega system, just 2 months after the destruction of New Canaan. Elena found battle reports that described the encounter in clinical terms, but even the dry military language could not hide the ferocity of the fighting. The attackers had been confident in their superior technology and greater numbers. They had expected to defeat the human fleet quickly and then deliver another lesson about the futility of challenging their authority. Instead, they found themselves facing an enemy unlike anything they had encountered before. Human ships had fought with complete disregard for their own safety, ramming enemy vessels when their weapons were exhausted, and using their damaged hulks as weapons against other targets. Human crews had continued fighting even when their ships were crippled and their life support systems were failing. The battle had ended with the complete destruction of the attacking fleet, but at a terrible cost in human lives. Similar battles had followed across the galaxy, each one demonstrating that humans would accept any sacrifice necessary to achieve their goal. But the attackers had still believed they could win through their superior technology and numbers. They had retreated to their heavily fortified homeworlds and prepared for a siege, confident that the humans would eventually give up and return home. They had been wrong about that too. Elena closed the datapad and sat in the darkness of her hotel room, trying to process what she had learned. 800 years ago, her species had been capable of something that most of the galaxy still found unthinkable. They had committed themselves to the complete destruction of another intelligent species, and they had pursued that goal with patience, determination, and skill that had terrified everyone who witnessed it. But Elena was beginning to understand why. The recordings from New Terra, Hope's End, and New Canaan had shown her what humans had been responding to. The systematic murder of nearly 2 million innocent people, broadcast live as entertainment and education for the galaxy. What would any species do when faced with such an atrocity? What would she do if someone destroyed her homeworld and killed everyone she had ever known, just to prove a point about their own superiority? Elena was not sure she wanted to know the answer to that question. The relentless Huntalina spent the next week tracking down military records that had somehow escaped the galaxy-wide effort to erase this history. She found them in the most unlikely places: personal letters sent to families, supply requisition forms filed by logistics officers, even maintenance schedules for warships that had participated in what humans called the Justice Campaign. What emerged from these scattered records was a picture of warfare unlike anything the galaxy had seen before or since. This was not a conflict between governments fighting over territory or resources. This was an entire species dedicating itself to the complete elimination of another species, and they pursued that goal with methodical precision that impressed and terrified their enemies. The Justice Fleet had not fought like a traditional military force. Instead of trying to capture territory or force a surrender, they had focused entirely on finding and destroying every member of the species that had attacked the human colonies. They tracked fleeing ships across interstellar space, followed refugees to remote systems, and investigated every rumor of survivors hiding in unexplored regions of the galaxy. Elena found a personal journal written by Captain James Rodriguez, commanding officer of the human warship Remembrance. His ship had been assigned to hunt down survivors who had fled to the Outer Rim territories, far from the main centers of galactic civilization. Rodriguez's journal entries showed how the Justice Fleet had approached this task. Day 847 of the campaign. One entry read, "We received intelligence that a small group of survivors has established a hidden base in the Kepler 438 system. The base is well concealed and heavily defended, built inside an asteroid to avoid detection. A conventional military force would probably ignore such a small target. But we are not a conventional military force. Every survivor who escapes today is a potential threat to innocent people tomorrow." Rodriguez had spent 3 months preparing for the assault on the hidden base. His ship had conducted detailed reconnaissance of the entire star system, mapping every asteroid and identifying every possible escape route. When the attack finally came, it was swift and thorough. No one escaped. "We found evidence that they were already planning new attacks," Rodriguez wrote after the battle. "They had detailed intelligence on human settlements throughout the galaxy and were developing new weapons designed specifically to kill humans more efficiently. They showed no remorse for what they had done and no willingness to change their behavior. We made the right choice." Similar entries appeared throughout Rodriguez's journal and in the records of hundreds of other human ships. The pattern was always the same: careful investigation, thorough preparation, overwhelming force applied with surgical precision, and complete destruction of the target. The humans were not interested in taking prisoners or negotiating surrenders. They were interested in making sure the threat was permanently eliminated. Elena found records of attempted diplomatic interventions by other galactic species. The Andromedans had offered to mediate peace negotiations between humans and their enemies. The Centauri Federation had proposed establishing neutral zones where survivors could live under international protection. The Zephyrian Republic had even offered to relocate all survivors to isolated worlds where they could live in exile without threatening anyone. The human response to all these proposals had been the same. Elena found a copy of Admiral Morrison's reply to the Andromedan Peace Initiative, sent during the second year of the Justice Campaign. "The species you wish to protect has demonstrated through their actions that they consider genocide to be an acceptable political tool. They destroyed 3 of our worlds not because we threatened them, but because they wanted to send a message to the galaxy about their own superiority. They broadcast the murders of 2 million innocent people as entertainment. They have shown no remorse for these actions and have stated clearly that they intend to continue such attacks against any species they consider inferior. We cannot allow such creatures to continue existing in our galaxy. They are not political opponents or military enemies. They are a disease that will spread and kill innocent people whenever they believe they can do so safely. The only cure for a disease is complete elimination. We appreciate your offer to mediate, but there's nothing to negotiate. They will surrender unconditionally and submit to justice, or they will be destroyed. There is no third option. Elena found similar responses to every diplomatic initiative. The humans had made it clear that they would accept nothing less than the complete surrender or elimination of their enemies, and they would continue fighting until one of those outcomes was achieved. The galaxy had watched with growing alarm as the justice campaign continued year after year. Human fleets ranged across known space, following every lead and investigating every rumor. They established monitoring stations in remote systems to watch for fleeing survivors. They offered enormous rewards to anyone who provided information about enemy hideouts. They even recruited agents from other species to help track down refugees who might be hiding among alien populations. But what truly shocked the galaxy was the patience and determination humans displayed. Most species expected the campaign to end after a few major victories, when humans had achieved revenge for the destruction of their colonies. Instead, the Justice Fleet continued operating for 6 full years, hunting down every survivor they could find. Elena discovered records of the final major battle of the campaign, fought in the home system of the attacking species. By this time, their once mighty empire had been reduced to a handful of heavily fortified worlds defended by the last of their military forces. They had concentrated everything they had left into a desperate final stand, hoping to inflict enough casualties on the Justice Fleet to force a negotiated peace. The battle lasted for 3 months and became known as the Siege of the Core Worlds. Elena found tactical reports that described the fighting in detail. The defending species had built massive orbital defense platforms, deployed millions of automated weapons, and created defensive fields that could destroy entire fleets of attacking ships. The humans had approached this final challenge with the same methodical patience they had shown throughout the campaign. They had spent a full year studying the defenses, developing new weapons and tactics specifically designed to overcome them, and gathering the largest military force in their history for the final assault. When the attack began, it was not the desperate charge that the defenders had expected. Instead, the humans had systematically dismantled the defenses piece by piece, using new technologies and tactics that their enemies had never seen before. They had accepted enormous casualties without wavering, replacing destroyed ships with new ones, and continuing the assault until the defenses were completely overwhelmed. The final entry Elena found was from the personal log of Admiral Morrison, recorded on the day the last enemy stronghold fell. "It is finished," the Admiral had written. "We have confirmed the elimination of the last military forces and civilian populations of the species that destroyed New Terra, Hope's End, and New Canaan. Our intelligence networks have found no evidence of any survivors hiding in remote systems. After 6 years and 4 months of continuous operations, we have achieved our objective. The galaxy is now safe from the threat these creatures represented. No other species will ever again have to watch their children die for the entertainment and education of self-proclaimed superior beings. We have ensured that such an atrocity can never happen. Again, may God forgive us for what we had to become to protect the innocent." Elena closed the datapad and stared out the window of her hotel room at the lights of Sanctuary Prime stretching to the horizon. 800 years ago, her species had demonstrated a capacity for systematic destruction that had shocked the galaxy into silence. They had pursued their enemies with patience and determination that bordered on obsession, accepting any sacrifice necessary to achieve their goal of complete elimination. But they had achieved that goal. Elena's research had found no evidence that any members of the attacking species had survived the Justice campaign. An entire civilization, one that had possessed advanced technology and a mighty military force, had been erased from existence by humans who refused to accept that genocide could be used as a political tool. The galaxy had learned something about humanity during those 6 years, something that had influenced interspecies relations ever since. They had learned that humans, while generally peaceful and diplomatic, were capable of becoming something far more dangerous when pushed beyond certain limits. Elena was beginning to understand why the galaxy had agreed to erase this history from their records. It was not to protect the memory of the extinct species. It was to make sure that no one would ever again be tempted to test humanity's limits in such a catastrophic way. The price of peace. Elena's final breakthrough came from an unexpected source: the personal archives of Fleet Admiral Chen Wei, the human commander who had succeeded Admiral Morrison in the final year of the Justice Campaign. Unlike the official military records, Admiral Chen's private files had been stored in a secure facility on Earth and had escaped the galaxy-wide effort to erase this history. Admiral Chen had been a thoughtful leader who understood that the Justice Campaign would have consequences far beyond the elimination of humanity's enemies. His private journals revealed a man who was deeply troubled by what his species had become. Even as he recognized the necessity of their actions, "We are no longer the species we were 6 years ago," Chen had written near the end of the campaign. "The galaxy looks at us with fear now, and they have good reason to be afraid. We have demonstrated that humans can become something terrible when we choose to do so. The question now is whether we can choose to become something else again." Elena discovered that the final phase of the Justice Campaign had been more complex than she had initially understood. It was not simply a matter of destroying the last enemy strongholds. The humans had also been forced to confront a coalition of galactic powers who had finally decided that the campaign had gone far. Enough representatives from over 200 species had gathered at Sanctuary Prime to demand that humans end their pursuit of the remaining survivors. The coalition had been led by the Andromedan Republic, supported by the Centauri Federation and several other major powers. They had assembled the largest peacekeeping fleet in galactic history and positioned it between the Justice Fleet and the final enemy strongholds. Elena found transcripts of the final confrontation between Admiral Chen and the coalition forces. The meeting had taken place aboard the Andromedan flagship, with representatives from dozens of species present. The coalition spokesman, an Andromedan diplomat named Kethvar, had spoken for the assembled powers. "Admiral Chen," Kethvar had said, "your species has spent 6 years pursuing justice for the atrocities committed against your colonies. You have achieved that justice. The species that attacked you has been reduced to a few thousand survivors hiding on their homeworld. They pose no threat to anyone. It is time to end this campaign and allow the survivors to live in exile under international supervision." Admiral Chen's response had become legendary among the few beings who remembered this history. Elena found multiple copies of his statement in various archives, all identical word for word. "Ambassador Kethvar," Chen had replied, "I appreciate the concern of the coalition for these survivors, but I want you to understand something very clearly. The beings you wish to protect are not refugees or prisoners of war. They are the last remnants of a species that used genocide as a form of entertainment. They broadcast the murder of our children to the galaxy as an educational experience about the proper place of inferior species. 6 years ago, these creatures had the power to destroy entire worlds and the willingness to use that power against innocent people. Today they are weak and hiding, but they remain the same creatures who committed those atrocities. If we allow them to survive, someday they will recover their strength, and when they do, they will kill again. We are not fighting a war for territory or resources or political advantage. We are eliminating a cancer that threatens every peaceful species in the galaxy. You can stand aside and allow us to complete this necessary work, or you can fight us and become complicit in the future atrocities these creatures will commit. But we will not be stopped by good intentions and misplaced mercy." The coalition had attempted to enforce their demands through military action. Elena found battle reports describing the brief but intense conflict that followed. Human ships had fought through the coalition blockade with the same ruthless efficiency they had shown throughout the campaign, accepting heavy casualties but never wavering from their objective. What had shocked the coalition was the complete unwillingness of human forces to be deterred by superior numbers or the moral authority of the international community. They had fought as if nothing in the universe mattered except completing their mission, and their enemies had finally begun to understand what they were truly facing. "We are not dealing with a military force that can be defeated or a government that can be negotiated with," one coalition commander had reported after his fleet was scattered by human forces. "We are dealing with an entire species that has decided something must be done, and they will not stop until it is done. I do not think anything in the galaxy can stop them except the complete achievement of their objective." The coalition had withdrawn after 3 days of futile fighting, leaving the humans to complete their work. The final battle for the enemy homeworld had lasted only 6 hours. Elena found no detailed records of that battle, only a brief notation in Admiral Chen's journal. It is finished. May history judge whether we chose correctly. In the aftermath of the campaign, the galaxy had faced a profound crisis. Humanity had demonstrated a capacity for systematic warfare that threatened the foundations of interspecies relations. If humans could decide that an entire species deserved to be eliminated, what would stop them from making similar decisions about other species that offended or threatened them? Elena found records of the emergency sessions that had followed the end of the Justice campaign. Representatives from hundreds of species had gathered to discuss what should be done about the human threat. Some had proposed military action to force humans back to their homeworld. Others had suggested economic sanctions or diplomatic isolation. But the wiser voices in the galactic community had recognized that such measures would likely only provoke humans into demonstrating their capabilities again. Instead, they had chosen a different approach. The solution had been proposed by Keeper Voss, the same elderly Zephyrian who had spoken to Elena in the archives. 800 years ago, he had been a young diplomat serving on the Galactic Council, and he had suggested a radical approach to dealing with the human problem. Rather than treating humans as a threat to be contained, the galaxy would invite them to become peacekeepers and mediators for interspecies disputes. Humans would be given the responsibility for maintaining galactic stability and preventing the kind of atrocities that had triggered the Justice campaign. The proposal had been controversial, but it had also been brilliant. By giving humans a constructive role in galactic affairs, the other species had channeled humanity's protective instincts into maintaining peace, rather than pursuing vengeance. And by making humans responsible for preventing atrocities, they had created a system where any species contemplating genocide would have to consider the possibility of facing the Justice Fleet again. Elena found a copy of the treaty that had established this new order. The language was formal and diplomatic, but the meaning was clear. Humans would serve as the galaxy's protectors, with the authority to intervene in conflicts that threatened innocent life. In exchange, they would agree to limit their military actions to peacekeeping and to work within the galactic legal system whenever possible. But buried in the treaty's appendices was a clause that most species had probably never read carefully. It stated that if any species committed acts of genocide or crimes against sentient life on the scale of the attacks on New Terra, Hope's End, and New Canaan, humans would be authorized to pursue justice by any means necessary, without interference from other galactic powers. Elena realized that the galaxy had not simply forgotten about the Justice campaign. They had institutionalized it. The threat of human retaliation had become the ultimate deterrent against genocide, and the fear of provoking humanity's wrath had helped maintain peace for 800 years. She also understood now why the history had been erased from public records. The other species did not want their populations to know how easily humans could be provoked into becoming an unstoppable force of destruction. They preferred that humans be seen as natural peacekeepers and diplomats, not as a species capable of systematic extinction warfare. But the leaders of every major civilization knew the truth. They remembered what humans had done to the last species that had chosen to test their limits, and they had made sure that knowledge influenced their decisions about how to interact with humanity. Elena closed the datapad containing Admiral Chen's journals and sat quietly in her hotel room. Outside, the lights of Sanctuary Prime continued to twinkle in the darkness, representing hundreds of species living together in peace. That peace was maintained, at least in part, by the memory of what had happened to the species whose name had been erased from history. She thought about the recording device her team had found in the underground chamber, with its desperate message about humans who never stopped and never forgave. The being who had made that recording had been terrified, but Elena now understood that the fear had been justified. Humans had proven themselves capable of becoming something that the galaxy had never seen before, a species so committed to preventing certain kinds of atrocities that they would pursue justice across space and time until it was achieved.